And so I want to put this out there because it's what I always say to them. And I think that this is important for other
Yeah.
people to consider too. Is like, and I don't mean this as an insult, I just think it's the truth. Someone who says that they can't do with plugins what they can do with analog is not speaking to the capabilities of the tools, they're speaking to their own capabilities.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Mark Matthews.
Hey folks, welcome back or welcome to the Inside the Mix podcast. Before we dive into this episode, I want to know if you've got a question because I'd love to hear from you on the podcast. Click the SpeakPipe link in the episode description to submit your question. Share your social media handles or website or whatever it is you're working on at the moment and get featured in an episode, plus one lucky question or listener submission will win a coffee voucher on me each month. And I say you'll get to feature on the podcast. If you're unsure of the format, check out episode 175 and you'll get an idea. So that aside, today I am thrilled to welcome back my guest, Eric Mitchell of Eric Mitchell Audio. He's returning for his second stint on the Inside the Mix podcast. And the episode last year, so I say last year, so that was in 2024, it was episode 143, The Art of DIY Mastering, Tips and Strategies to Master Your Own Music, was actually the most popular episode of 2024. So much so that we've got Eric back on today. So if you haven't heard that one before, do go check it out. Obviously, listen to this one first, then head back and listen to that episode. But that's enough of my rambling. Eric, how are you? And thanks for joining me today.
Great, man. How are you? It's good to be back.
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I'm getting in the swing of things. A lot of interviews at the start of 2025, so just
Nice.
greasing the interview wheels again, mate.
There you go.
Yeah. I think this is the third or fourth one of the year, which is great. Enjoying it,
Nice.
getting back in the swing of it, mate.
Right on.
But yeah, it's a pleasure to have you back on. So for those of you who might not know or have not listened to episode 143, shame on you. Eric is a true audio industry multi-hyphenate, songwriter, producer, mixer, mastering engineer, live sound expert, and educator as well. He works predominantly with electronic artists and labels, and fans of the band Glassjaw may well know his work on the live sort of scene. He's been responsible for their live sound since 2018 and also remastered the 20th anniversary vinyl box set. So today, we're going to be diving deep into the often misunderstood topic of mastering digital distortion. Now, we did allude to this in episode 104. I said we were going to come back to it, and that's what we're doing today. So you mentioned in that episode about using distortion in mastering, and it really piqued my interest. So, and how to use it creatively, and also I think it's important to know when to avoid it. So I think it'd be good to start. Maybe if you could start by explaining digital distortion to our listeners and what to look out for, and why it's such a nuanced topic in mastering.
Well, so just based on my past experience with clients, I think when you say like digital distortion, there's probably like two like different applications of that terminology. One, which I would consider is like intentional distortion or like saturation, things where you're trying to bolster the sonics on purpose. And then there's like digital distortion in like the artifacting sense, where there are like distortions happening as a result of processing that may not be intentional. And so I think it's like important to talk about both sides there. And so obviously like intentional distortion, there's saturators. Distortion, for those people who don't know, it's like when you hear a guitar amp and the guitar is all gritty and dirty, that is a saturation. If you didn't have that on there, the guitar is essentially going to be clean. So it's adding harmonics, even in odd harmonics, to the original signal. Well, even and or odd, depending on which saturator you're using, I guess. And so that's like the on the face like application, I would think. But in my mind, saturation is kind of almost happening everywhere. And an example of that I'll give you is like compression. I almost think of compression more as like distortion in color than actual compression, because like all compressors compress, right? And so like what is the main differences between them, which is usually like their distortions or like the box tone that they're gonna add to your signal. So most of the time when I'm picking compressors, I'm not picking for the compressor itself. I'm picking for the color of the
Yeah.
distortion that it's going to add to my signal. So certain compressors for drums, certain for guitar, vocals, vice versa, where the saturation that it's going to add, it will complement the signal. And on the opposite end, like managing unintended distortions, especially within electronic music or any genre where like super loud output is the desired end result. It's almost impossible to get such high outputs without introducing distortions from, clipping and limiting and things like that. And so
Yeah.
I found that using multiple stages of those things, doing little bits rather than like heavy-handed processing, allows you to manage the stages more fine-tuned and manage where the distortion is coming in, or minimizing it to a degree that it's not adding anything negative to the end result. Sorry, that was a long ramble.
No, that's fine, mate. No, I was just taking it all in. So what we have there is we've got two, you mentioned there, sort of intentional and unintentional distortion. So the intentional being saturation, adding even. And then we've got digital distortion. So that's sort of like the non-intentional, almost sort of like destructive sort of distortion. So it's interesting there what you mentioned about distortion in series, because that's often the approach that I take with regards to compression. So it kind of marries in my thought process. And you see that a lot as well. Rather than just being heavy-handed with one compressor, you do it in series.
Mm-hmm.
So can you elaborate a bit about how you use that creatively in mastering there? Because you touched on it there with regards to we're aiming for, I say aiming for, I don't want to use the term aiming for, but obviously within electronic music, it's got to be a certain loudness, right? For it to be competitive, especially when it's played out in a club environment or on a sound system. So how are you sort of using digital distortion in mastering to add character and sort of, let's say, emotion to a track?
Well, lots of different ways. So like, I can't remember if we went over this in the last episode, but so I don't want to be too repetitive, but I primarily stem master.
Yes, I remember that. Yep.
Maybe like 1 out of 100 masters is a stereo master, so it's almost all stems. And so my workflow allows me, again, like more control over where I want to apply saturation and distortion and mastering because of that.
Right.
So like I can use some saturation on the drum stem that's separate of the bass stem or the synths, and I can really control the tones. And so generally I'm almost never adding distortion and stuff to low end and like the sub range. I try to keep the bottom of the mix, the master, like as clean as possible, just because subs and everything needs like that room to breathe. And so I don't want to compress and saturate and squish, that range so much.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, a lot of times I'll look to distortion as almost like a form of EQ. So like, let's say there's like a synth stem that is a little dull. It's like, sure, I can throw an EQ on there and like, crank a high shelf or find the presence range. But sometimes using distortion and tailoring the distortion with like a high pass or a band pass and focusing it on just a certain range, you can bring that presence or the life into the signal without EQ just by the distortion.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And it's kind of like another, that's the great thing about music in a way, isn't it? Like you can do more than one, you can achieve a similar result with more than one sort of technique or tool. And that's exactly what you're doing there. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Shane Slack, and he was talking about depth and how he used bit depth on his drums on a beat, rather than just going for the obvious sort of like compression or saturation, like you say. He was using bit depth to do that. So you mentioned saturation there. Are at any point are you actually sort of using digital distortion, like overloading? I say overloading. Yeah. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when you get to the final stage of the master and you're getting like your final level output, for me, it's typically like the master processing, and then I'll hit a clipper and 2 limiters. And so in the clipper, clearly we're like pushing it over and clipping it. And so there are distortions that occur there. And with electronic music, especially, or any loud music, I guess, where I've come to arrive is, so I actually over-engineer the transients into the master.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because when I get to the end, I'm going to clip and limit. I still want it to be punchy, but clearly the goal here is that we're clipping transients, right? Because we're trying to clip so that the limiter's not working too hard. So every time we're, clipping off those transients, we're going to get distortion. But when done in the right way, clipping distortion can actually add impact to the transients in the drum. So whereas like a lot of people, you'll say like, oh my God, like clippers, they're killing transients. If you over engineer the transients and you're clipping them the right way, they actually bring some punch because of the distortion that occurs every time the clipper is clipping the transient.
Yeah, just to interject there. When you say over-engineer the transient,
Yeah.
what is it you're doing there when you're over-engineering the transient itself?
Well, so I like to think of mixing and mastering like I listen to two overall aspects. There's like the balance of the mix, of course, like the
Yeah,
tonal sonic balance, but then I also listen to like the transient balance. And so what I mean there is like oftentimes you'll get a mix in where like the snare is ripping up here, but then the
yeah,
kick is
yeah.
only cutting through like here, right? So like the transient mix is not balanced. Like all the drums should be punching through and so when I say over engineer, if let's say at the end of the track, this is the main part of your mix and these are your transients, that's where you want them to sit. Before I get to mastering, I'm engineering like the transients super
Right,
exaggerated,
right.
like way poking out of the mix so that then when I clip the mix down, it's back more where the relationship I wanted, but then I have the ability to control how much of that transient I'm clipping down into the mix. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah, I get you.
And then the other part of that is I particularly enjoy using SIR standard clip, which has a saturation option where it will apply saturation only to the signal when it's being clipped.
Right,
So
yep, yeah, yeah.
if you're only clipping your transients and then you just give the tiniest little bump of that distortion onto the clipped signal, it helps round the corners on the clipping, and so it's not so sharp, but you still get like the nice punch. It just sounds like unclipped transients, even though you're clipping. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. That's the same clipper that I use. It's a very good
Nice.
clipper. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a
Yeah, I love
fantastic
that one.
piece of kit. And it's super affordable as well, if I remember
Yes.
rightly. I think I paid about 20 or 30 quid for it, whatever the equivalent is in dollars. It's still it's very good. And you're only going back to the sort of like the conversation that we had just now about doing it in series. One clipper, or are you finding that you're using multiple clippers in series again, or are you just doing the heavy lifting with one?
It kind of depends on the track and like how extreme of output they're asking for because like you get like the standard loudness, but there are this handful of clients that it's like holy moly, like you're trying to blow the speakers up with this output.
Yeah.
But so it really depends on that, but I would say like on average, one clipper, two limiters.
One clipper, two limiters. I love that because that's exactly what I do. So I love that you're saying that.
Yeah, yeah, man.
That's great, man. I was thinking then when you were talking, obviously paying attention, but it also reminded me of another podcast that I was listening to when they were going through, and they had audio examples of clippers, limiters, compression, trying to achieve a similar thing. And I think thinking now in preparation, it would have been quite cool to do something similar. Maybe that's another one for further down the line
Yeah,
again and get some audio examples. I did something similar with Ian Stewart last year when we went through mid-side processing, and it worked out really well. So yeah, man, it'd be great if we'll get some audio examples so the listeners can delve into that.
yeah, we could do that.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool to do, just so they can hear the difference. Because I found it really useful when I was listening to that podcast, and I wish I could give it a shout out, but I cannot remember. I think it was Sonic Scoop. I could be wrong. I think it was Sonic Scoop.
Right on.
But going back to what you said about you using stems, and I remember the conversation we had now about stem mastering, where often they'll send you the project, and you've got, if I can remember rightly, you've pretty much got every DAW
Yes.
set up, ready to go, like in a hot site, as it were, ready to launch.
Yeah.
Can you mentioned about not using distortion on the low frequencies. If someone was to send you a stereo mix, could you still do something similar? Is it a similar process? Because obviously there you've got less flexibility in terms of how you can treat each frequency range.
Yeah, definitely less flexibility in a stereo sense, but even there, like, the tools that we have at our disposal now for adding and managing distortion most of them are not just wideband. Like you could tailor, what part of the frequency you want it to be working on. Like E2, for example, Plug-in Alliance. I don't know if you ever use that one.
I don't think I've got a lot of plugin Alliance plugins, but I don't think I've ever used that one. I might
Yeah,
have done.
so the HD2 black box, it's a saturator.
Of course, yeah, I have. Yeah, yep.
Yep. But that one, like, you can choose to do like a high pass and only saturate, like the upper and or a band pass and just focus it. So like a lot of times I'm not doing just like wide band. I'm very specifically focusing where the distortion is being applied.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thinking back to my question now, I probably could have answered that myself the way you've described it there. Yeah, we've got more discrete control now, haven't we, over the individual bands and how we process them. So it makes perfect sense. So this kind of segues on nicely to my next question. And this is going down the route of sort of like common mistakes producers, engineers, mastering engineers might make when using distortion in their mastering. Can you tell our audience how they can possibly avoid those pitfalls?
Sure. I feel like saturation and distortion to me is kind of like salt in food, right? Like most food needs a little salt to wake up the flavor, but you can very quickly and very easily oversalt your food, right? And so like the thing with distortion is it's kind of almost like blurring an image, right? So it's like if you have this signal that's very crisp and pristine, the more distortion you add to it, the more smeared and blurry that gets, right? Because it's adding all the harmonics, it's filling in all the space between the original lines that were so clean. And so we talked about this last time too, like the in 2025, this abundance of like bad audio advice on the internet, and how many Instagram videos you'll be fed where somebody's like, you want huge subs, throw on the distortion and saturate your whole mix and crank the low, like there's so much bad advice. And so like it's really just, I think, again, going back to what we talked to in the last one too, is just like using your ears, right? Because it's you got to listen to what you're doing and not just be like doing these things because someone in a video told you, or you think that's what you should be doing. Obviously you got to experiment to learn the stuff, but like it's the pitfall here, I think, is like, okay, I've distorted my subs, now I'm distorting my synths, let's distort my drums now to like push them up into everything else, and at the end you've just got this big ball of distortion. It's like you can't really, you don't want to go overboard with it, but a little bit goes a long way. I feel like it's an additive thing, right? Because like if you added a little bit here, a little bit there, by the time you get to the end, all those small things have added up to something significant and meaningful.
Yeah, wise words, my friend. Yeah, I remember having that conversation about the whole like social media and various try this, and this, and it reminds me of how I was helping somebody out with some mixing, and they came in with a project, and they had a plug-in chain. And I was like, what have you got going on here? And he was just kind of like, oh, this is what my friend told me to do because it worked for him. And I was just like, yeah, that's good, man, but I don't know if it's going to work in this instance. So you gotta like, I like what you said there about using the salt and food analogy, and how you gotta sort of like, it's counterintuitive, but pepper it in here and there, and where it's needed. And right. I think it's quite easy. I remember when I first started out, when I was producing, and I would be working on something and thinking in a silo, in like maybe I'm working on drums and bass and whatnot, and thinking, I'll add a bit there and then do another bit and add a bit. But when you get to the end, that's when you realize you've got too much. So it's kind of like you need to think of the bigger picture. If you're doing it individually, you can quite easily, like you say, you get that big ball of distortion. And it's kind of the same, I find, with time-based processing as well, like reverbs. When people start sticking reverbs on every channel, then you get this big mono. It's almost like big mono, just a big reverb.
Exactly.
Because you've just overdone it. And I think it's so easy to do. And I mean, this is probably another episode in itself, but I think it's just overthinking it and thinking you've just got to throw the kitchen sink at everything. You've got all these tools, all these plugins and these techniques, but you don't have to use them in every track.
Correct.
I think that's key.
Yeah, and another thing you just brought up there too is like, especially with like the reverb and distortion stuff like this, like for someone in a non-mastering context who's just like making the track or perhaps even mixing, some of that stuff is way less apparent before it's mastered, right? Because it's the background information, and as soon as you make the track, minus 4 LUFS or whatever, some stupid thing, all that stuff that was in the back is now just as loud in the front. So you've got cranked reverb tails, cranked distortion, all this other stuff comes forward that you may not have noticed when it was
Yeah,
quiet.
yeah. Have you got any tips on, like, for those who are noticing that and getting feedback from mastering engineers or whatever it is they're using to get that final master? What would you advise them do to
Um,
nip that in the bud before it gets to the mastering stage?
so probably two things. Like for myself, when I'm producing, if for any of that kind of stuff, like reverb is a wonderful example. Like that, I know in the end it's more atmospheric and vibe and not supposed to be in the forefront. I'll put it where I think it should be, and I'm like, okay, that's the level where I want it to be at the end, and then I'll just bring it back a couple dB because I know that it's gonna get lifted in mastering. The second thing you can do, and this is like dangerous advice because there's so many mastering engineers that are like, don't do that. But like, you can put a limiter on your master bus and like test
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
mastering. Like, don't, I wouldn't say throw that on there and work into it. Just use it as like okay, I'm gonna turn this on, and what does my mix sound like when I limit it? Obviously, there's gonna be way more going on when your track gets mastered than just a limiter being thrown on, but at least it gives you a quick little window into like what happens to my mix once things get kind of squashed.
Yeah, so the first one there is something I do as well. Is like with reverb and delay, I'll get it to the point where I can hear it, and then I'll just back it off, knowing that it's going to be where it needs to be further down the line. And what you mentioned there about sticking the limiter on the end is great. I think that's really good advice, to be fair. I mean, it's not going to replicate, or it's not going to replicate what it's going to sound like when it's finally mastered, but it'll give you a good idea of what's poking out and what maybe needs to come down in certain aspects. And I know some DAWs now, for example, Logic has a built-in mastering assistant, so you can use something along those lines. But yeah, like you say, it'll give you a good idea of if reverb tails are sticking out too much, or maybe you need to dial the feedback on a delay or something. I think it does work. So we're touching a nice little segue. This moves on to the next part. So specific tools or plugins you'd recommend for working with digital distortion. You've already mentioned Black Box, and you've mentioned the standard clip as well. Are there any others?
Yeah, a really incredible saturation tool by Tone Projects called Kelvin. Are you familiar with that one?
No. I've got a few Tone Projects plugins, but not
Unisum.
Kelvin.
Yeah, they have that Unisum compressor, which is awesome as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, Kelvin, and then Acoustica Audio has a master bus processor called Snow, which is emulating, I believe, the Neve Portico 2 master bus processor. But it has the two saturation distortion flavors in there, the silk, like the red and the blue, which on the hardware is something that sounds magical, and they captured that really well. So I use that a lot for like top end saturation and distortion. What else? Dark Glass, the bass plugin.
Nice. I haven't heard of them. The
Neural
last two I haven't heard of.
That's by Neural DSP.
Oh no, I like the Neural DSP stuff. I've got a which one have I got? I think it's the Portnoy. Is it the Portnoy? I can't remember. It's sidetracking now. It's making me think now what guitar emulators I've got.
Yeah,
but the Neural DSP stuff's really good.
It's very good. Yeah, they made a Dark Glass bass pedal-in plugin.
Wow.
Which has like a very specific distortion sound that I use a lot on like effect sends and things like that.
Yeah.
And their guitar amps actually, like, I've used their guitar amps creatively a lot on like synths and other things besides guitar, vocals, stuff like that.
That's made me think now. I've never actually thought about doing that. I've only ever used it on guitar. I've never thought of using it on a synth. I'm going to do that on my next track and give it a go. Yeah, I've never thought of using it because some of the sounds and the patches in there are wild, man, and they're really, really good. I'm going to give that a go.
And on brand with this episode, those amps, they're just distortion boxes, you know what I mean? So yeah, really, you can really get some crazy stuff out of your synths with some of the colors in there.
Yeah, do you find that do you ever like limit yourself to how many you use in a project, or is it literally just down to if I feel it's needed, then I'll stick?
Yeah, no limits here. Like I can't remember if we went over this, but I run a Hackintosh. Like I purposely built like this. It's like a 10 core, all cores overclocked to like 5.2 gigahertz, so I can run just like launch everything. And I'll even still hit ceilings with this, like because I'm using stems, and you get a couple Acoustica plugins and some soothes and spiffs going, and it caps out pretty quick. But no, I don't put a limit. It's more just like But that being said, I will say I also don't struggle with like I see this come up a lot where people are like, "How do you know when it's done?" Like I don't struggle with that either because I can just hear, okay, it's balanced now. Like I'm not hearing any more problems.
Yeah.
So I just go until I don't hear any issues, I guess.
Yeah. That's really interesting because that is like a common pain point that I get mentioned to me by like on Instagram or whatnot by listeners of the podcast.
Yeah.
Sort of like you've been doing it for a while now. At what point did you get where you were thinking to yourself, you know what, I trust my instincts now. It's done. It's done. How long did it take to you to get to that or did you do? Was that like straight away?
Definitely not straight away. Like for the first, I don't know. I'm trying to remember and guess here, like 3 to 5 years of doing this, I was still, taking it out and doing the car test and stuff like that and questioning, my own judgment and feelings.
Yeah.
But like even before I started doing this as a career, I was doing it for myself in my band. So I even had time before that too. But it's just like with anything, right? Like you do it long enough and you gain this like comfort and familiarity that's kind of hard to relay to anybody who doesn't have it because the only way you can get it is by putting the time in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I think that's why it's such a pain point is because like if somebody who doesn't have that experience yet says to me, "How do you know when the song is done?" and I say, "I just know."
Yeah. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
like, "What the hell? That's not helping me." You know what I mean? It's like it's hard to relay how you know because it's your experience that's informing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. When you know, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really give myself any boxes or guidelines. I don't even use templates. Like I don't like to approach a song with like a pre-built anything because it's a new song that's never existed before and I want to treat it like uniquely and give it its own attention. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Nice. I remember the conversation now. Then you get into mastering out of necessity.
Yeah.
I think it was, wasn't it, when you were working on your own tracks, and then you sent it to. Did you send it to an engineer? We won't name names, and then it didn't quite come back the way you
Yeah.
wanted, and then you moved into doing it yourself, if I remember rightly.
Correct. Yep. Good memory.
Yeah. It's all good, but you know what? The amount of interviews and people I speak to, I'm very surprised. I surprise myself sometimes with how I remember these things.
I was just gonna say with the amount of interviews you're doing, that's impressive.
Yeah. It's when I say, "Oh, did we chat about this?" and then I realize, "Oh no, that was totally someone different."
Yeah.
And then it gets really awkward, and I have to just move on to something else really quickly.
Like whoopsie.
Yeah. I did have one other question, and I can't
Mhm.
remember if I asked you this last time. Are you in the box, solely in the box? Did you have any outboard gear?
I'm in the box now. I worked for a very long time with outboard, like 50, 60 grand worth of like the nicest analog I could get, like
Yeah.
NIF, Vertigo, Master, like all the top shelf stuff. And the issue there was like analog recall is a massive pain in the ass, and especially for someone like myself, if I'm doing 3 to 4 masters a day, and these are a lot of like independent EDM artists who oftentimes, again, we're talking about how they don't have the experience to know how the mix is going to translate to mastering. That can also result in a lot of times like I'm just trying to help realize the artist's vision, and so I'm not trying to change like the mix or the balance. You know what I mean? I'm just trying to master it. But
Yeah.
let's say it comes back and now like the reverb, like we're talking about, is cranked. So they're like, "Oh, I didn't know the reverb was going to get so loud. Can you turn that down?" That's kind of stuff that comes up a lot with these independent artists that may not have as much experience. So that equals revisions, right? And so
Mm.
like if I'm doing 3 or 4 a day and they're coming back with, "Can you turn the reverb down?" I've already gone and mastered like 3 other tracks. Now I got to go recall the desk to turn a reverb down. Like,
Yeah.
and so it was adding a lot of time to the day. So the way that I came originally approached that was like, okay, analog revisions I have to charge for. Like in the box revisions are free. Analog revisions have a small fee attached.
Makes sense.
And I was also even charging more for the actual master when it was analog just for the added time soak.
Mm.
And as a result, there were less and less people going for the analog because of the cost difference. And so I actually ran a test for like over a year where I just like stopped using my analog. I didn't tell it. And this was actually during COVID, right? So like
Yeah.
there wasn't anybody coming to the studio anymore and watching me. It was all remote or like whatever. So I decided I was going to run a test because you always have those arguments where people are like, "Oh, if you'd done an analog, that would have sounded better." But it's like you can't you can't master the same song twice without being biased from the first master. So I'm like, I'm just gonna use the clients as the test, right? So
Yeah.
I stopped using my analog for a year and just went ITB, and I didn't tell anybody. And even some clients who I knew were only coming to me because they were like gear snobs, and I want you to run it through the NIF tube, like whatever, like tube compressor for the box tone, like stuff like that, like real analog purists.
Yeah.
And I did all the masters ITB, and nobody said a peep. Nobody said anything changed. Nobody said anything sounded different. There was literally not a peep. And so I was like, okay, like that's enough for me. Like I sold all my analog, and I've been only plugging ever since. That was probably 3 years ago or so.
Yeah. Makes sense, doesn't it? You went down the route there to kind of doing like a blind test, if you will, and just not letting them know. You can information bias, can't you? As soon as you tell somebody, oh, it's done a particular way, inherently, maybe consciously, subconsciously, they're going to think a particular way based on the information you've given them. Yeah, you see more and more people doing that, I guess. And the the recall element of it as well makes perfect sense. And I think, have you noticed? I suppose you wouldn't really. I don't know. Have you noticed a drop off, or have you noticed an increase ever since in terms of clients, people coming towards you since?
No, kind of no change in either direction in that regard. It was more just like, you mentioned the bias, like that obviously exists within ourselves too. So it's like, my own bias would affect if I was trying to decide, which one of these workflows sounds better, right? And so that's why I'm like, these are the clients, like this is their art, like they know it way more intimately. I'm hearing it for the first time for a master. They've already listened to it like 300 times,
Yeah.
It's like if something changes in a negative way, or like the quality that they expect from me after working with me for so long changes all of a sudden, they're gonna notice, right? So, and they didn't. And, ever since then, I've, been on the receiving end of a lot of malicious online discussion in like mastering groups where you have these guys that they have all the stuff like I used to have, and they're arguing that it's superior. And so I want to put this out there because it's what I always say to them, and I think that this is important for other people to consider too. Is like, and I don't mean this as an insult, I just think it's the truth. Someone who says that they can't do with plugins what they can do with analog is not speaking to the capabilities of the tools. They're speaking to their own capabilities.
Nice. I like that. It's going to be a good soundbite for the episode.
You got a bunch more hate for that one.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree.
And I specifically say that because what I will say in defense of the analog guys is that it is a shorter path with analog, right? So like, if I'm trying to get to endpoint X, I can get to that endpoint with either tool set, but the analog one is shorter. It takes more plug-in processing to equate to the same sonics in the end.
Yeah.
But it's definitely possible now is what I'm getting at. And so like I think anybody who can't do that just hasn't explored modern plugins enough to figure it out for themselves yet. You get what I'm trying to say?
I do. Yeah, I do. I have seen these conversations in various forums, and I'm always a voyeur, just looking at the comments and reading what people are putting in particular. Yeah, it's always interesting when you start that debate, mastering engineers worldwide or something along those lines.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And this is coming from somebody who, like a lot of times you see those conversations, it's coming from the two sides of the people who own one or the other, or subscribe to one or the other, but don't have the cross experience. But like I worked for a decade on analog. Yeah. So I'm someone who's already had all that and done both. And I'm telling you, the tools don't matter.
Fantastic. I think that's a great place to wrap up the episode. 35 minutes in, man. So yeah, Eric, it's been a pleasure having you back on the podcast today to go through the distortion side of things, as we alluded to in episode 143. Audience, do go listen to that episode as well, because we do reference it a bit in this episode today. So before we wrap things up, is there anything you're working on, anything you want to share with the listeners, or maybe, and also where they can find you online?
Definitely, yeah. You can find all my info at ericmitchellaudio.com. And then as far as what I've been working on that I'm most excited about to share is I actually have like a desktop audio meter I've been working on. It's like a 11 function real-time analyzer. and I just launched that last month. And so anybody who's looking for like a nice desktop RTA, you can get that at captiveaudio.com.
Nice. I will put a link in the episode description, both through the website and also for the frequency analyzer as well. I'm
Thanks,
sure.
bro.
Did you put posts on Instagram? I'm sure I did see some. I see some stuff on there.
Yeah, I posted a few like
Yeah.
just with the launch, but yeah, we just like put the pre-order up, and then I'll be able to start shipping them like March, April-ish time.
Fantastic. Amazing, man.
Well, I've been using the prototype for like 2 years, and I don't want to be without it now. I love it.
Yeah. It's so cool. Whenever I speak to guests, and I always say, like, have you got anything you're working on or you want to share? And some of the stuff is just it's quite left field of what you'd expect. You'd expect sometimes you think it'd be like a release or some music.
Yeah.
It's quite cool. I was chatting to someone who's another podcaster, but also a producer as well, and they're releasing a chatbot, and they've gone down that route. So it's really interesting to see how people are pivoting, still within the music industry and music tech, but just slightly pivoting with regards to like either the technical side of things with AI, or like you're doing yourself with regards to the analyzer and actually creating some sort of hardware component that you can work with, which is really interesting. It's also quite inspiring as well. It makes me think, man, I want to start to pivot in these different directions.
Hell yeah, man. Well, yeah, like my parents raised me on the mantra that you should always have lots of irons in the fire.
Indeed, yes.
Especially being self-employed. So it's like I'm always just trying to make sure my butt's covered, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I bet you're spinning many plates, as we say.
Yes,
I don't know if that translates, but yeah. Many irons in the fire, indeed, man. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. Like I said about that episode, in like a year's time again, we'll do the whole. We'll get some audio examples and then chat through those. I think that'd be really cool. Really cool.
Absolutely.
Yes, mate. I will. I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll catch up with you soon.